The governor of California has ordered churches, gyms, and hair salons closed in most places in the state as the coronavirus cases keep on rising. Governor Gavin Newsom has also extended the closure of bars and indoor dining. California confirmed more than 8,000 new COVID cases yesterday. Hospitalizations have increased 28% over the past 2 weeks. As the nation continues to wrestle with issues of racial equality following the death of George Floyd, tonight we take a look at the growing debate in the U.S. over the removal of Confederate symbols. Last week, a judge issued an injunction barring the city of Richmond from removing any more Confederate monuments for 60 days. Richmond's Mayor LeVar Stoney, citing his emergency powers, had ordered the removal of all city-owned Confederate statues over concerns about public safety amid continuing protests. Joining me now on Skype to help us examine this is Gloria Purvis, host of EWTN's Morning Glory. Gloria, welcome back. So good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Tracy. Always happy to be on EWTN News Nightly to talk with you.
Well, we love having you on, you know that. Well, you and I have spoken before about the tragic death of George Floyd and the progress needed to go forward. Do you think the removal of Confederate symbols are a step in that direction? And also, Gloria, do you think the removal of these symbols will help in the nation's healing process?
Well, I think we have to look at why these symbols were put in place in the first place. People perhaps are familiar with the cult of the lost cause myth, which is where people are trying to rewrite history to say that the Civil War was about states' rights, not about owning slaves, even though if you look in the Articles of Secession by the slaveholding states, they make it clear that they are leaving the United States over their right to own slaves. This cult of the lost cause rewrites history to say that that wasn't the case. It was simply states' rights. It was not about slavery. They try to paint this as an epic battle between two civilizations, with the South, while losing, still being the superior civilization because it had values of men having honor and women being chaste and faithful, and enslaved persons being happy and subservient and deferential to whites. And they thought that their way of living was a model for race relations. And so, as a part of trying to vindicate the cause of the Civil War, people who wanted to embrace the lost cause mythology and promote it, not only pursued educating children in the lost cause myth, but they also raised these monuments as evidence of the sacredness of the cause of the South in the Civil War.
Even though many Confederate symbols are being physically removed, it's still difficult to remove them from our nation's painful history, especially for African Americans. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, yes. I mean, if the whole purpose of the lost cause mythology and the erecting of these monuments was to remind people of the Southern way of life, the traditional values and beliefs, and that would not be defeated in the Civil War, it's reminding African Americans that their view of us is that we were happy, faithful, being enslaved, and that we preferred our role in the society as deferential to white. And it completely glosses over the gross abuse of enslaved persons as human beings, the rape, the murder, the breakup of the family, all for money. And these things are a sad part of our nation's history, and particularly grievous to African Americans and other people of goodwill who recognize that enslaving human beings is contrary to what a human person is supposed to be if they're made in the image and likeness of God. And so it's not just African Americans, but also those who are of goodwill and prefer historical truth recognize that the myth of the lost cause is one that has no place in our country.
Yeah, and Gloria, I'm sure you know there are some people who feel that the Confederate symbols are part of our American history and should be preserved just for that reason. What do you think about that, and how can we move forward taking both those viewpoints into account?
Well, I think it's a question of why should these Confederate symbols, which are part of the lost cause mythology, be put in prominent public places, like outside courthouses and whatnot. To me, that doesn't seem to make sense, especially when it's a distortion of the actual history of why the Civil War was fought, and it makes the way African Americans were treated as if it's something sacred and to be honored. Now, if they want to keep them in Confederate graveyards and at Confederate battlefields, that's one thing, but to put them in revered places of public honor, I think is a wrong move for us. And also, let's be clear, we still have our history books. This history will not be lost in terms of the accuracy of why the Civil War was fought and what relations were like in the South for African Americans. That history will not be lost. We still have history books, and people are still writing books about the Civil War. And in fact, one book I would recommend to our viewers would be Kevin Levin's Myth of the Black Confederate. It's still one of those myths that's out there that African American enslaved persons willingly fought as soldiers for the Confederacy, which was not true. So we have a lot of new scholarship out there, even further dismantling the myth of the lost cause. We can keep the history, but let's make it truthful.
Well, Gloria, thank you so much for coming on. We always appreciate your insight. Great to see you. Gloria Purvis, host of EWTN's Morning Glory.
Thanks, Tracy.